We start off this evening by recognizing and thanking our generous sponsor, Martha Mackey, for her continued support of ArtWise, and to Acumen Wealth Advisors for their support of the current exhibition, Power, Passion, and Pose, photography by Ken Browar and Deborah Ori. If you are just tuning in now, I want to welcome you to this evening's ArtWise with director, author, curator, and fashion historian, Patricia Mears. After viewing our current exhibition, you may have been struck by the stunning costumes and couture featured throughout the photographic images of dancers mid-leap. Tonight, Patricia Mears joins us to provide a deeper understanding of the history and importance of couture fashion and its relationship to dance. Mears is the deputy director for the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. In addition to her administrative duties, she has organized numerous exhibitions and written the accompanying books, Ballerina, Fashion's Modern Muse, Norel, Dean of the American Fashion, Yves Saint Laurent and Halston, Fashioning the 70s, Ivy Style, and is also a contributor to the recent Taschen publication, Fashion Designers A to Z, to name a few. Prior to joining the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, she was the assistant curator at the Costume and Textile Collection at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where she organized numerous exhibitions on the intersection of art and fashion. Especially after a year where the sales of the dance icon leggings increased 60%, we are thrilled to have Patricia Mears here tonight to discuss the parallel histories of couture and dance. Patricia, welcome. I turn the screen now over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and my great good thanks to Adara for all of her work on our behalf, to the Hunter Museum of American Art, and to all of you who are joining us tonight. What a great honor and a wonderful opportunity to get a chance to talk about the beautiful work by photographers Ken Browar and Deborah Ori. So let's see if I can get this going. There we go. All right, so if we could start with the first slide, please. This is a wonderful image, and some of you may already be familiar with it. This, to me, in some ways crystallizes what Ken and Deborah are all about. Incredible photographers who've chosen some of the greatest dancers in the world in some of the most beautiful fashions to perfectly accent and bring to us not only very contemporary work, because they are speaking to us very much from today's viewpoint, but they channel so much of the beauty, the elegance, and the history of both dance and fashion. And I hope to illuminate some of those points for you today. This is just to start off with Tyler Peck, one of the world's greatest ballerinas, incredible technician, as well as moving artist, in a gown by Garavino Valentino, one of Italy's greatest couturiers. Could I have the next slide, please? I will say that a lot of my comments really are musings because I am not a specialist in dance history and know something about photography, but certainly I'm not a specialist. Most of what I'll be talking about tonight is filtered through my own work. As Natalie mentioned, my last exhibition was Ballerina, Fashion's Modern Muse, and it was both an exhibition and a book that traced how and why high fashion for the first time came to influence, ballet came to influence high fashion for the first time, starting in the 1930s and lasting through most of the 20th century. Next slide, please. Much of the work focused on haute couture. In some cases, it was couturiers and designers looking to dance performances, such as those performed by Anna Pavlova. This is actually a shot of the interior of the exhibition. That is her dying swan costume to the left. We were very thankful that the Museum of London would lend it to us. And we juxtaposed it with a number of garments that showed the influence that ballet had. We also wanted to present how the ballerinas themselves used high fashions as a way to burnish their images and to elevate their status, not only as performers, but as members of society, as we see here. Next slide, please. But also important in all of this was how both classical ballet and modern dance help advance fashion. The Americans especially were great at adapting elements from their rehearsal wear and translating that into active wear, or if you will, athleisure, a term that's very popular today. Next slide, please. One of the things that was so amazing through this process was getting a chance to go through thousands of pages of high-end fashion magazines, mainly Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. And what was astounding was to see the amount of dance coverage in these publications, readily available to readers around the world. Not only did they feature ballet, but modern dance as well, and Broadway, and sometimes social dance. And the thing that was incredible is the coverage appeared in nearly every other issue. So we're going to go back in time to sort of examine how this happened and to look at how Ken and Deborah have been able to extract elements of the past, mostly really beautiful images and ideas, but transform them for a modern audience and to really reflect, as I noted, our feelings about dance and depiction of the human form today. Next slide, please. Many of you know that classical ballet is a very old art form. It was already codified and professionalized as early as the 1660s. And by the 18th century, a number of women stars had become very important, such as La Camargo, as we see here. Now, while she had a moment, we certainly see that she is wearing a garment that's very much of its time. It's basically a high fashion dress, but what she has done is to lift the skirt so we can see her brilliant footwork. This was considered quite scandalous, but even with those modifications, again, what you are seeing is a high fashion garment. Next slide, please. By the 20th century, ballets or interest in ballet had really revived and had become very important. And fashion designers like Jean Lanvin, whose work we see here, became a way of expressing an alternate view during the 1920s. Most of you are familiar with the columnar sort of flapper style silhouette. Well, Lanvin gave us an alternative, the 18th century inspired dress that she also nicknamed the Camargo. And this particular piece may likely have been inspired by a Ballet Russe performance, Carnival, that had the figure Columbine and thus the name of the dress. Next slide, please. But what is so different when you see Ken and Deborah's work is they've been able to utilize technology, capturing dancers frozen in time beautifully. I'm sorry, if we could have the next slide, please. Here we have the lovely dancer, Indiana Woodward. And Indiana is quite extraordinary because although she's a brilliant technician, she's a wonderfully romantic and evocative dancer. And I've always wondered whether Ken and Deborah inherently understood her, if you will, performance style that tends to be not necessarily as modern as it is more romantic. And we have this wonderful dress by couturier Maggie Norris, who chose a fabric that's an exact replica of a material that was woven for Marie Antoinette's bedchambers in Versailles. And this connection between the 18th to the 21st centuries, to me, is quite remarkable. Again, there's nothing historical about the image, but certainly the essence and the beauty of what we think of coming from the 18th century is captured here. Next slide, please. Now, let's leap ahead to the next century. About 100 years later, we have the Greek Marie Taglioni. She epitomized what ballet became. It was securely a woman's art form by this time period. The supernatural narrative featuring sylphs and fairies were the types of roles that allowed women like Taglioni to not only become an international star, but to become very well respected. The young Queen Victoria was enamored with Taglioni and actually dressed up and pretended to be a sylph when she was a young girl. But we also see the connection to fashion. We can certainly see that the dress of the time period with its full-sleeved, fitted waist and bell-shaped skirt were appropriated by ballerinas, although the volume was greatly reduced and we certainly see a more diaphanous skirt. But very importantly, if you see peeking out from that pink dress on the right, the little shoe, that was the genesis of the modern day point shoe. Next slide, please. Now, sadly, from this real peak and importance of the ballerina within the performing arts began to fall quite precipitously in France, paralleling the dramatic rise of ballet in Russia at the same time. But many of us don't know this because when we look at these beautiful images by Edgar Degas, for example, the great artist who really painted some of the most beautiful ballet pictures in history, all we see is a beautiful performing artist. Next slide, please. And they've been able to appropriate and depict that type of imagery with, again, a modern sensibility. I love the fact that Ken and Deborah, commissioned by Harper's Bazaar, chose Misty Copeland, a very important dancer who, as we know, became the first African-American ballerina to become a principal with American Ballet Theater. But the thing that's interesting is that we see her as an accomplished artist and a person worthy of respect. The reality for ballerinas at the time, however, was quite different. Next slide, please. This image is actually far more, I think, representative of what was going on in classical ballet. These men hanging around backstage actually dictated how the performances were to be structured. They, the abonnés, as they were known, of the famous Jockey Club, instilled a rule that all operas had to include ballets. Why? Not necessarily because they were ballet fans, but they were fans of the young ladies. And since many of these dancers, in fact, the vast majority, were appropriated from the lower classes in France, came from poverty and remained in poverty because they were so badly paid, they had to turn to prostitution in order to survive. So this sort of unsavory quality of ballet is something that unfortunately tainted Western European dance for a long time. Next slide, please. But by the interwar years of the 20th century, these dynamics have changed. And I think this particular image from Vogue magazine in 1937 expresses that viewpoint. The dancers are in some ways on a more or less equal standing, if you will, to the socialite who comes backstage to meet and greet some of the dancers. And again, by removing the men from the image, it again creates a very different dynamic. Next slide, please. So what happened? Well, the Ballet Russe and Russian ballet happened. As we see from this quote written by Lincoln Kirstein, the great Harvard-educated athlete who did as much as anyone to bring classical dance to America and make New York City the capital of dance, he wrote a long essay for Vogue magazine documenting and really illustrating the impact that the Ballet Russe had on Western culture. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. The next slide is actually an image of two of the most important figures who were responsible for bringing Russian classical dance to the West, Sergey Diagolev and Anna Pavlova. Many of you may recognize those names. Diagolev was very famous as being an art impresario who became smitten with classical Russian ballet. But rather than bringing the classics to the West initially, what he brought were the beautifully trained dancers, and he brought with him a whole new cadre of artists, choreographers, as well as composers who created an incredibly new avant-garde and very dynamic form of ballet, in some ways moving away from classical dance. It had so much impact that Diana Vreeland, the famous fashion editor, said the Ballet Russe was the only avant-garde she had ever seen. Likewise, Anna Pavlova was the greatest of all ballerinas at that time period. Although she died before the age of 50, she had traveled some 300,000 miles around the world and brought ballet to the far corners. Yes, we are having images. Thank you, Ruth. This is technology. There we are. There's Miss Pavlova. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, this is actually one of the most important aspects of her career, because aside from being a brilliant artist, she was also someone who was a very savvy self-marketer. She disseminated thousands of pictures of herself in her most famous costumes, from the Dying Swan to the Dragonfly. But she also made sure that people saw her in the latest fashions. We know she was a client and wore Mariano Fartuni and Liberty of London, and it was documented that she wore some couture. Now, who exactly, I don't know, but I've always wondered whether someone like Paul Poiret, whose gown we see illustrated on the left, may have been one of those designers. Next slide, please. Even posthumously, Pavlova continued to have influence. Here we have Elsa Schiaparelli, the great Italian-born couturier, wearing a cape that she made as an homage to Pavlova shortly after the ballerina's death. And I think Schiaparelli took a bit of pride in the fact that she looked a little bit like Pavlova and was sometimes mistaken for her. Next slide, please. But what Ken and Deborah were able to do was appropriate a certain element that struck me. This wonderful dancer, Calvin Royal III, is a principal with American Ballet Theater, and they did photograph him wearing this little cape in various ballet poses, but it's this one that struck me so beautifully. He's almost angelic here, and the ability for a male dancer of color to wear a vintage piece of couture sort of transcends this sort of fixed idea that we have to see someone in a particular role presented in a certain way. By erasing those barriers and erasing those preconceived notions, what we're left with is simply a beautiful image of a dancer. Next image, please. Now, this man is certainly one of the most famous of all time, and certainly one of the greatest. In fact, George Balanchine and Mikhail Baryshnikov believed that Fred Astaire was the greatest male dancer of the 20th century. Next slide, please. But here we have Paul Taylor dancer, Michael Trusnovic, appropriating not only Fred Astaire's style in terms of dancing, but even the costume. This is a borrowed tux, and the dancer noted how it sort of made him sit up straighter and move in a certain way. Next slide, please. But what I love about Ken and Deborah's work is they eradicate any notion that there's a level of change of comfort or feeling for him. All you see is a beautiful image. I wanted to make one quick point about men's costumes. Fred Astaire, like many leading male stars of the time, actually had their wardrobes custom made by British tailors. And this was the case for Mr. Astaire. One of the cutters from Anderson and Shepherd, a leading Savile Row firm, remembers that he would dance up and down the hallways of the dressing room in order to make sure that the coat and the trousers always fit perfectly and never impeded movement. And I think one of the great privileges of my career was doing a project where we were able to actually borrow some of his custom-made shoes, and you can see them on the left there. Next slide, please. Now, as the Ballet Russe continued to dominate in the 1920s, we start to see the burgeoning of fashion photography, embracing, if you will, a somewhat dancerly quality. Now, these images are static, certainly because the technology was so different in those days. But you do see, for example, in this work by Baron de Meyer, an effort to create some kinetic movement. And he's done it beautifully with this luminous incandescent light and with a beautiful lacy, very feminine garment. Next image, please. The desire to create movement was also important to others like Edward Steichen, who had a much more, if you will, delineated, graphic, and strong approach to photography, very different from de Meyer. But it has sort of the same effect with the use of this wonderful Art Moderne scarf. And in fact, it's also photographed on a dancer. One of the things that would become increasingly popular in fashion magazines starting in the 20s and going all the way through the 1980s. Next image, please. Ken and Deborah takes this idea, this almost Erte-esque Art Deco idea of using the sleeves and movement to create a very different kind of image for me. While it has all the wonderful elements that we saw in the previous two pictures, it also presents the dancer as almost an athlete. She's so strong and her physical strength is not hidden. And it doesn't, in my opinion, undermine the beauty and the femininity of the image and the fashion as well. Next image, please. Now, while Art Moderne certainly had a moment and was very important in fashion as well as in dance, the impact of classical dance on fashion really begins in the 1930s. And it's this particular article that was so important. It was an 8-page editorial spread in Vogue covering a ballet production called Cotillon, choreographed by George Balanchine. It featured 3 very young Russian descent dancers. They were all based in Europe, Western Europe at the time, in Paris specifically. And we see that this particular garment, which is designed by the artist Christian Berard, brings forth all the elements of the romantic ballet, but also how it's photographed by George Hornigan-Huene, one of the most important fashion photographers of the 20th century, shows this, if you will, collaborative symbiotic relationship, topped off with the fact that the dress is made by Barbara Korinska. Next image, please. What's so important about it is that it launches what would become the look of the 30s, the slinky, if you will, sort of bias cut dresses by the mid-century become, if you will, overtaken by these more romantic dresses, once made of tulle that clearly echo the look of a ballerina's romantic costume. And none other than the modernists like Coco Chanel fully embraced this idea. Next image, please. So too did the greatest couturier of the first half of the 20th century, Madeline Vionet with her ballet skirt from 1924, and this tulle gown from 1938 that was, as Vogue described it, made for Zorina to dance in. And they're referring to the Broadway and ballet dancer Vera Zorina here, which I think is quite an extraordinary thing. And this dress is actually, a version of this dress was bought by the Duchess of Windsor. Next image, please. Here we have Christine Chefchenko, a wonderful principal dancer with American Ballet Theater, wearing a dress that clearly evokes and reflects those styles that started to become so important in the 1930s. But so different is this pose. Again, a strong, muscular ballerina, but still graceful and caught in really a pitch-perfect moment. That level of dance and movement really was not capable of being depicted back in these period pictures. Next one, please. Even so, this idea, whether the image was more static or not, this is clearly meant to be a still image of ballet dancers, Irina Baranova and Nini Tailad, show again this intersection between ballet-inspired fashion and its importance within the magazines. Next picture, please. But it's so different from the way in which Ken and Deborah are actually really able to capture this animation, but perfectly still, almost a kind of hyper-realism. But the dresses, while they so clearly, in my opinion, evoke the elements of the time period, and the dancers are so elegant, their strength, almost their athleticism, also comes through. Next image, please. And one of the things that I think is interesting, while many of the pictures have a kind of sweetness and a romanticism, there is a kind of dark and brooding quality to a lot of fashion photography. Let's remember this was still the height of the Depression. And in this particular year, this dress photographed by Man Ray in 1936 happened at the same time that the huge labor strikes were going on in France and the rise of fascism in Europe. So it was quite a dark period as well. Next image. And Ken and Deborah are able to bring a little bit of that into this particular picture. And again, I think their ability to read dancers is so amazing. Here's Lauren Lovett, one of my favorite dancers. She's a very special performer. Again, while she's technically very brilliant, it's her ability to project and give us a sense of her inner self on stage that's not always so sweet and lovely. Lauren herself is delightful, but she is capable of embracing some of the darkest roles and bringing forth the type of energy that Ken and Deborah have depicted in this wonderful picture. Next image, please. I'm going to zoom through the next of these because one of the points I want to make is that ballet became so important that countries like Great Britain and America ardently absorbed them. While a lot of the fashions were made in France, couturiers in places like Great Britain also loved ballet. Charles James, one of the 20th century's most important designers, certainly loved ballet. Here we have you can't see it because the image is black and white, but it's a pink and black tulle dress. And on the right, a dress he actually named La Sylphide. Perhaps it's not a surprise that his sister was a ballet dancer. Next image, please. And we see the same types of collaborations going on in Great Britain here with the burgeoning ballerina, 17-year-old Margot Fontaine, in Friedrich Ashton's production, Apparitions, with costumes this time by artist-photographer Cecil Beaton, and again fabricated by Barbara Korinska. Next image. The thing that I found most extraordinary is how Cecil Beaton was able to help transform the image of the Queen, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Many of you may know that her husband suddenly became the king when his brother decided to abdicate, and they were thrust into the limelight. She was never considered a beauty or very fashionable, but the royal family thought it important to project and give her a more glamorous image. And I love the fact that she looks almost like a ballet character here. Many of you know that ballet is filled with queens and aristocrats and members of that particular class. But prior to this time period, no member of the royal family would ever allow themselves to even remotely be depicted as a ballerina. So for Hartnell to be able to design this wonderful dress and Beaton to produce this image, I think was a real turning point for the arts. Next image, please. Now, the ballerina who exemplified British style as much as anyone and who would translate that to the rest of the world was Margot Fonteyn. Much can be said about Margot's style and her restrained way of dancing. Next slide, please. But it was her connection to fashion that is of interest here. She became a client of Christian Dior as soon as he launched his fashion company in 1947. Next image, please. She was introduced by Roland Petit, a good friend of hers, who actually got Dior to make costumes for one of his productions. And this would become increasingly popular and prevalent, where major fashion designers would begin making ballet costumes and doing the sets and designs. Next image, please. But the couturiers clearly understood the importance of ballet. And here are two examples by Dior of the same character, the Black Swan from the Swan Lake Ballet. I think it's extraordinary that while the dress on the right doesn't immediately say to me, Le Saigne Noir or Black Swan, very clearly that's what the designer was thinking. Next image. This is the same case for Pierre Balmain. One of the things that I found is while he did do dresses like this one entitled Taglioni, he did a full range of ballet-inspired evening wear, whether they be dresses that looked very formal like this or others that appropriated elements of, say, knitwear and chiffon into some of his more unique renderings. Next image, please. And couture also found its way onto the silver screen for world-distributed ballets. Many of you are, I'm sure, very familiar with The Red Shoes, arguably the greatest ballet movie of all time and one of the greatest movies, period, of all time. Next image. The star, Moira Shearer, was a contemporary of Margot Fonteyn, and her on-screen imagery was wonderful, not only because of the dance sequences, but because of some of the extraordinary haute couture that was specially created for the film. And Jacques Fath was the one chosen to make most of her beautiful gowns in the movie. Next image, please. The idea of couture coming to ballet and being presented on the stage continued even as ballet moved to North America, specifically to New York. And we have Barbara Karinska in part to thank for that. After having worked as a designer herself, but also for others, she wound up becoming the head costumier for the New York City Ballet. Next image, please. And her work appeared not only on the stage, but in fashion magazines as well. She had been a couturier for a short time in New York, but is through this way that we see her creativity most vividly and most widely. Next image, please. Now, ballet was certainly important, but so too was modern dance. And I think one of the things that we see happening is the importance and the rise of kind of rethinking of what American style is, particularly during World War II, when we no longer had access to Parisian couture. I love this particular picture called The Gingham Girls by Adrian. Some of you may recognize the name. He was the great Hollywood costumier who left MGM in 1941 to open his own fashion house. And his use of gingham and varied patterns clearly evoke elements from our colonial past, as well as the pioneering days. And take a look at those chairs with their Conestoga wagon wheel arms and backs. Clearly, the message is set forth that this is very much an American and patriotic expression via fashion. Next image, please. We also see this on the stage. Here's the great Martha Graham in two costumes that she designed herself and performed in. Below, we have Primitive Mysteries, and on the left, especially Appalachian Spring, again, clearly evoking elements of American history. This was an important period in her creativity. And Martha Graham not only designed and made these costumes, she understood how the choreography could be enhanced and the storyline heightened with the proper use of volume and if you will, expansiveness within the skirts of her costumes. Next image, please. This is really one of the most extraordinary images that Ken and Deborah have taken, not only because it includes a multitude of dancers, we have 6 of them dashing across the background, but this incredible level of being able to capture their athleticism, their dynamism, as well as the importance in the movement of the costume, even though obviously this is a still image. This remains, I think, one of my favorite pieces that Ken and Deborah have done. Next image, please. And there was also a look at America's past through a different lens. The great Katherine Dunham looked to African-American, but also Afro-Caribbean culture as the source of inspiration for her dance company, her dance style, and her dance costumes. She was one of the best educated dancers, not only of her time, but ever. And I think the fact that she brought a kind of intellectualism heightened the quality of her dancing and her performances. Next image, please. It's not a surprise that Alvin Ailey, who formed his own company, was incredibly inspired by Dunham. And I love the fact that Jacqueline Green, seen here, is a perfect expressive medium for Ailey's style. Not only is she a wonderful athlete and dancer, she's also beautiful. And for me, as we saw with Graham and Dunham earlier, the use of volume, the skirt, to enhance her movement is absolutely pitch perfect. In this case, it is a couture gown by J. Mandel, but it nonetheless, I think, empowers and elevates the dancer. Next image, please. Now, the body is very important, so I'm briefly going to talk about how George Balanchine was one of the people credited, or perhaps, I don't know, we could use another term, for bringing forth the very thin, attenuated ballet body, one that has become part and parcel of the art form. And if you take a look at this cover from Time magazine, look at the subtitle under his name. It actually says, "Who wants to see pigs jump?" And so I think obviously at that time period, people were not afraid to say whatever they wanted. Next image, please, in terms of, insulting in some ways the female body. But it's through Balanchine that we see how the attenuated body style becomes increasingly important in America. This particular dance, Altanaquille Leclerc, may be one of the most important reasons why. She was one of the greatest dancers he ever worked with. She contracted polio at the age of 27 and was wheelchair bound the rest of her life. Nonetheless, in her short career, she had tremendous influence on American ballet, on American culture, and American fashion, as she appeared frequently in the magazines. Next image. One of the things that I found interesting, although of course we have a lot of American ballet theater dancers, is that the New York City ballet dancers seem to be the ones most frequently portrayed, including the great Mimi Paul. Here she is in a very modern, almost mod style presentation from the late 60s. And this was a trend that continued well into the 1980s. Next image, please. The other thing I did want to point out is how Ken and Deborah have, like other artists, focused on the male body. Here we have a really beautiful, but also somewhat homoerotic depiction of the male form by artist Paul Cadmus. He, like George Platt Lynes, the photographer, did many, many photographs of male dancers, both in costume, in rehearsal, as well as the nude body. Next image, please. And here we have Ken and Deborah producing their version of it. Well, clearly he's sexualized in this image. Daniil Simkin also is somewhat beyond and above that. It's interesting. He's a very small dancer in terms of height, but grand in terms of style. He's actually dynamic on stage. And I love the fact that this quiet image is really a celebration, if you will, of the male artist. Next image, please. This is where I think Ken and Deborah take it to a new level. This, for me, is kind of the male version of the three graces. They're the heavenly bodies. They're Apollo's angels. This almost religious trinity, if you will, takes dance to a new level, because certainly we're not looking away from the beautiful male body, the beautiful male dancer, but the fact that they are looking heavenward almost takes us to a new level. Next image, please. And in a certain way, Balanchine, with his emphasis on the lean, long body type, was trying to do the same thing by perfecting the line of the ballerina to, if you will, become the perfect instrument for his fast, brilliant choreography. Next image, please. That body type was clearly reflected in high fashion. As the century progressed, the 20th century, models were becoming thinner and taller and more articulated as well, as were the fashions becoming shorter in order to, if you will, show off those beautiful bodies. Next image, please. This symbiotic relationship really reached its peak when Clara McCardle and her fellow female designers really let loose the idea of activewear and, if you will, almost athletic wear for everyday use. We have the Japanese-born ballerina turned Broadway dancer Sona Osato modeling one of McCardle's rompers with a pair of Capezio slippers. Next image, please. This sense of freedom and movement was thought up by Diana Vreeland. She's given credit for telling her readers to go out and wear ballet slippers. Well, one of the reasons for this was the start of World War II. Many of you know there were shortages of materials, and basic things like leather shoes were rationed. Ballet slippers were not. So, next image, please. Claire McCardle became the first designer we know of to actually appropriate ballet slippers in her high fashion show in 1942. So successful was this collaboration that it did become an official collaboration where McCardle actually designed with Capezio, and we see a version of that here. Next image, please. So just as the ballet slipper was important, so was the leotard. It becomes a fixture of the young woman's wardrobe especially. It was not only featured in magazines like Harper's Bazaar, but also in magazines targeted to a younger audience, like Glamour magazine. And the idea was to combine the tradition of the dancer's workwear, or if you will, rehearsal wear, with the ideas of the 21st century, as they note Flash Gordon's super girlfriend. Next image, please. This continued well into the 70s, and I certainly was one of the people who wore an array of dance skin outfits, not only for dance class, but as you would leave and run around your day and then head to the disco at night. Next image, please. And here we have Monkey Wu, a dancer who is the perfect articulation within this ensemble made by Wolford, a company that began as underwear makers and transitioned to things that are a little bit more decorative, as we can see with the lace embroidered sleeves. And I love the fact also that it's an Asian woman's body, perfectly still and yet in motion. This idea of calm repose being the way in which the dancer projects herself in this image. Next picture, please. Now, ballet clearly is just one of many dance forms, and it, along with modern dance, have become modern and have become international. And this image of Samuel Lee Roberts in an outfit by Japanese designer Issey Miyake speaks to me that way. Its internationalism is not only because of the different backgrounds, ethnicities, and cultures of the designer, dancer, and choreographer, but also the fact that Miyake appropriated many elements from traditional textiles, not just of his native Japan, but other countries throughout Asia, the Middle East, South America, and Africa. So again, we have this sort of composition coming together, but also in dynamic movement. And I love the fact that his arms are articulated in a way that you feel almost as if you're looking at a globe or the world. Next image, please. I just wanted to juxtapose it with the work of Irving Penn, the photographer who Issey Miyake actually worked with to document much of his work. And while this beautiful raincoat made with the material used to fabricate Japanese umbrellas is gorgeous, it is very static. And the model to me appears almost like an insect caught in amber. You get the sense of movement, but it has none of the actual dynamism of the kind of thing that Ken and Deborah are doing. Next image. And here I'd like to conclude. There's so much to say about so much of this, but for me, this picture of Lloyd Knight, an American-based British-born dancer with Martha Graham, costumed by Halston, the great superstar American fashion designer of the 70s, brings together, again, all these elements of collaboration and is clearly a contemporary image, but it also evokes something from the past. As many of you know, Martha Graham looked to American historicism, but also to ancient Greece and Rome. Clytemnestra, for example, one of her great works, references ancient Greek myth. And yet, while Lloyd also would be dancing these types of parts, to me, he's like a modern day pharaoh. And again, transcending the idea that one's race or ethnicity, one's gender, one's sexual orientation determines your place within this art form. Ken and Deborah have broken those boundaries while adhering to the principles of beauty, symmetry, artistry, and have drawn upon, I think, so many elements of the pictorial image of dancers, the dancers themselves, and what the possibilities of combining all of these can be. So with that, I'd like to conclude and thank you very much and open up the floor to questions.
Wow, Patricia, thank you so much. So when I was prepping for this evening, I read a great quote from W Magazine's review of your recent publication, and I'd like to share that. And they said, like two sisters sharing a closet, fashion and ballet have borrowed freely from each other, and you really have, presented an incredibly fascinating, that interconnected and paralleled history of fashion and design. So we really appreciate you joining us this evening for that.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. It was really an honor.
And we had some wonderful questions. And again, to everyone who's out there, please feel free to add your questions in the chat feature down at the bottom. So I know when you were going through your slides, I was struck by so much of the beauty, especially of these clothing. I think if I could walk away with something, it would have been that Steichen photograph of the Art Moderne kind of scarf dress.
Yeah.
Which is actually our first question is along those lines. And, can you speak a bit more about kind of the next step in fashion as art specifically, and the difference between fashion as an item that you wear versus fashion as an item that is put on display in a museum?
That's a great question. Well, art is fashion. Fashion is art is a big topic. Let me just say that fashion has catapulted forward. I'm so happy to see, like dance, these two areas that were always deemed the women's fields, right, in terms of customers, is now being really seriously considered as a serious field of study and research. I will say that while many of us can see wearing these beautiful garments, once they become part of a museum collection, we treat them the way you would treat a Monet. You don't take them out. No, people don't wear them. We conserve them, preserve them, just as any museum would do. And the reason for this is they are very fragile. Fabric and paper are the two most ephemeral and fugitive of all the materials that you'll see in museum collections. And our goal is that we want the next generations to see them. I want people to see Chanel's from the 20s and the 30s. I want them to see Charles James pieces, which are very rare. And if we don't treat them with the kind of care that you would a famous painting, for example, they won't be here. So that's really the ethos behind our process of taking care of them this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Are there any examples of designers who were former ballet dancers or dancers who were formerly designers?
Oh, I see what you're saying, going back and forth. Well, I think Martha Graham is one of the best examples. She wasn't a fashion designer per se, but she really knew how to build clothes. And they had a fashion quality to them, because again, a lot of times if you see a stage costume, it's like, ugh, in person, when you're up close to it, it's not really beautifully made. And keep in mind that somebody like Barbara Korinska was a couturier. She actually had her own couture house in New York before she went to become the head of couture, with designed ballet costumes exclusively for New York City Ballet. I would say that it's hard to do both well. If you're a really top dancer, you may understand good clothes, but that doesn't mean that you can actually be a designer. So I can't really say off the top of my head that I've seen an example of a great dancer becoming a great designer, or vice versa. Some people have said that people like Terry Mugler have been studied dance, but Terry Mugler did not become famous because he was a great dancer. So, and maybe some of the audience members knows examples that I don't know.
I know that at least with the combination of dancer and photographer, that has really helped in terms of Ken and Deborah's photography, because Deborah was obviously a dancer before turning to photography, and I think that that is the key in terms of why she was able to capture such powerful images. Like you were saying, that Martha Graham image of the six dancers that look like they are kind of propelling forward, but are really just,
Exactly.
dancing and,
Yes.
jumping in that spot. So,
Exactly. No, she gets it pitch perfect every time.
right, right. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about, you talked a little bit about diversity and issues of diversity in ballet,
That's right.
but if you could talk specifically about the history of the nude ballet shoe.
The nude ballet shoe?
Right.
Oh, you mean like
So,
the brown point shoe, or the ones that match the skin? It's a
right.
good question. Now, obviously, point shoes are pink, supposedly to match the skin tones of Western European dancers. The earliest brown point shoe that was actually manufactured was by Capezio in the 1970s for the then Dance Theater of Harlem. Many of you may know this great company was founded in 1969 by Arthur Mitchell. He was a principal dancer with New York City Ballet. And after seeing Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, he said, look, I could remain someone who stays a principal dancer in a top company with mostly white dancers, but I want to create a platform for dancers of color, because their history has been not only could they not join companies or accept into companies, they couldn't even get dance training. One woman was telling about stories in the 1940s where she had to stand out in the hallway and try to figure out how to take a ballet class where everybody was in the dance studio. So the point shoe comes about at that time. Capezio was very progressive. It's great. So one of the things, unfortunately, the Dance Theater of Harlem had to close down for a while. And so Capezio did stop making them. Now, because of so many great dancers from around the world who are saying, look, not only who are African-American, but Asian and from other cultures are saying, for us, for our leg line to look beautiful, to match the tights that are our skin color, we need the shoes. And we don't want to pancake them and put skin color on, because a lot of them put makeup on their shoes to match their tights. They're now being manufactured by companies like Freed, which is absolutely fabulous. But it is a long-term process. And so pink also is not necessarily pink. There's some of the tights and shoes that look almost white. Some of them have a peachy color. So, it was a way, it was used by some people to keep African Americans out of classical dance. Oh, you couldn't possibly, you don't match the right tone and skin color for the tights and shoes.
And I know that in a lot of interviews, Misty Copeland talks a bit about that as well, and the difficulty of finding a shoe color that matches her tone.
Exactly. And, this has been going on for decades. It's so great that we know Misty now, but I've been talking to dancers who were stars in the 60s and the 70s and even before then, and the real challenges they faced. Costuming was one of many, long list of things that they had to overcome.
So we still have quite a few questions. One question that just came in was, most designers now have their own muses and do not seem too eager dressing others. Do you know why earlier designers chose to dress ballerinas?
Well, I think it's one of the things is they were clients. I mean, Anna Pavlova did buy her clothes, so obviously that was important. But I think this collaborative process was partly because, remember, fashion and the arts and high society, it was a much smaller, tight-knit community. People all knew each other. So the process of designing something for a socialite versus an artist was not too outside of their realm. Today, fashion is so different and it's so much harder in some ways. But there was also more, if you will, a sort of centralized, unified sense of beauty. Who is beautiful? What is the beautiful body type? Today, what's exciting is that we have a much wider range. So designers are not fixed with any one particular person. And what I would say, it was the ballerina as kind of a leitmotif. She was a symbol of something. So it was not necessarily just one dancer that you would be inspired by or want to work with. But in the case of someone like Margot Fonteyn, she went to Dior. She said, please make me this. So sometimes she would buy samples at the end of the season because she was so small with her 20-inch waist, or once in a while she would commission a piece like her wedding ensemble in 1953. So the dynamics have changed because the industry has changed so much.
And you mentioned the choreographer, George Balanchine. I think one of his famous quotes was, "Ballet is woman."
Yes.
So a question that came in said, are there examples where ballet is man or ballet is male, specifically in terms of dance's influence on traditionally male fashion?
That's a good question. It really, you start to see the impact of somebody like Václav Nijinsky very early in the 20th century, but we didn't see, if you will, a rolling over of those things that he wore on stage really anywhere within mainstream men's fashion. It was also, again, men's clothing was very rigid and codified in the early century. We start to see the break and the change happening when Rudolf Nureyev becomes an international star. And in fact, that movement was called Prince's Lib, you know, the liberation of the prince. They often portray a prince on stage. And then here they are walking around with the latest fashions. I remember when Nureyev was being interviewed by Dick Cavett on television. And if you've not seen the interview, do go look at it. It's quite hilarious. But he comes out in a Nehru suit and these sort of knee-high snakeskin platform boots. It's fabulous. And he was one of the reasons why the more flamboyant style of male fashion, the sort of peacock revolution of the late 60s and 70s, was helped to advance, in part because you had very gorgeous, but also flamboyant, strong personalities like Nureyev pushing that forward.
Patricia, I want to thank you so much for joining us, especially in this virtual setting, taking the time to speak with us about the influence of fashion and ballet. This has been such an insightful discussion and truly an enjoyable evening. Some of the remarks, and I'm amongst them, I can't wait to get back into the galleries now to look more closely at the couture that's on display and the couture that's within these images. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to everyone. My only bit of jealousy is that I'm not there to celebrate and see the show with you, but I look forward to seeing the installation shots very soon.
Well, Power, Passion, and Pose is on view at the Hunter Museum through September 6th. And obviously, you're very welcome to come and see it in person.
Great.
I want to thank our generous sponsors again, Acumen Wealth Advisors, for their support of Power, Passion, and Pose, photography by Ken Browar and Deborah Ori, and Martha Mackey for her support of ArtWise programs, including this evening's very insightful discussion with Patricia Mears. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this evening and you come see this remarkable exhibition for yourself in the near future. Again, thank you to our speaker, Patricia Mears, the Deputy Director for the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and for all attending. Have a lovely evening and good night.